great. So yeah, so we're going to jump straight into then starting to think about cultural attunement. But if you're anything like me and with my brain, whenever I learn something new, I kind of want to know its context. I'm one of these people that likes to get a sense of where am I going to place that new information in the wider kind of map of my knowledge and thinking before I kind of jump in and look at the detail. So my brain often works as a telescope and microscope. I'm a telescope that I want to zoom out and look at the bigger picture first before I then kind of switch into microscope mode and zoom in then and look at something in detail. So what I think would be really useful to do first of all is to kind of zoom out and go, okay, in thinking about cultural attunement, where do I kind of hook or place this new information or content or concept rather into the rest of our thinking? Because for me, very specifically, and what we'll see in a moment, is cultural attunement for me sits at the heart of my broader working within diversity model. So what I'm going to do in the kind of the first part of this morning's session is walk you through the model, so that then when we start to think about cultural attunement, you can start to see where it is kind of placed within it. Okay, so as I said, kind of giving us first of all that kind of background or that kind of initial foundational framework, so that we can then start to think about cultural attunement in more detail. So as I said, I do have a slide deck that we're going to work through, and I will then describe the slides as we go through them as well. Sasha, I'm aware that you're kind of familiar with how I teach, so any slide decks that I have, I will describe them as we go through them. So I'm just going to open up the slide deck again. There we go. So we're now screen sharing. And so where I kind of want to start in thinking about why do we need to think about cultural attunement, and why have I named it cultural attunement? As I said, we have to kind of start from the background thinking behind it first. And for me, it is the shift from working with diversity to working within diversity. For those of you that have already bought the book and started to kind of flick through it, maybe you might be kind of familiar with this kind of what I call kind of my workings out. Those of you that I have taught previously you'll be familiar with me saying this throughout today. I'm going to share with you my workings out. What I want us to first of all think about is, why have we actually moved from, or why have I moved from working with diversity to working within? Because in order to move from working with to working within, can we then actually start to use the concept of cultural attunement? It doesn't work. Cultural attunement actually won't work or doesn't fit with what is kind of the status quo at the moment in counselling training, which is this concept of working with diversity. And so I will own that I have a problem with the term working with diversity. And I'm going to deconstruct that for us very briefly in order for us to kind of reconstruct it under this brand new framework of working within diversity. So on this slide, we have the problem of working with diversity. And then I've drawn two circles, each circle to represent the two people in the counselling room, counsellor and client. Okay, so our starting point with, if I deconstruct working with diversity, is the starting point of we have a counsellor and a client. And the counsellor is in therapeutic relationship with the client. So there's a one-way arrow from counsellor towards the client, saying that the counsellor is in therapeutic relationship with the client. And when we actually deconstruct the term working with diversity, if we are working with a client and we are working with diversity, this actually implies that diversity itself is with the client. So diversity lives over on this one side in the circle that represents the client. I often imagine this almost like, you know, the English heritage blue plaques that they put alongside the famous buildings where such and such famous person lived here. I always imagine that in my head every time I see this slide, because I think it's almost a bit like saying diversity lives here with the client. And so the moment that we say working with diversity, we are actually implying that it is the client's identity then that is diverse and different, because diversity lives with the client, that we're working with diversity, we're working with a client who is different and diverse. If that is happening when we think about working with diversity, and therefore then the client's identity is diverse and different, it implies then, well, who are they different from? Who is the client diverse and different from? And it means, and it sets up a dynamic in which we're actually saying that when we're working with diversity, the client is diverse and different from the counsellor. Okay. So by saying we're working with diversity, we are attaching diversity to the client's identity, and therefore implying that the client then is different and diverse from the counsellor. What that then does in return, it then positions the counsellor as normative, centred and neutral. And what I mean by that is that whoever the counsellor is, their identity is the norm, that it is neutral, that it doesn't hold any value because it's centred in a dominant identity, because it is the client who is diverse, it is the client who is different. So the counsellor automatically gets placed as neutral in their identity. Okay. So let me just go back a slide actually. So that's the setup in this slide of what I've just explained, that there is this kind of deconstruction of, if the counsellor is in therapeutic relationship with a client who is diverse and different, by positioning the client as diverse and different, they are therefore diverse and different from a counsellor who is normative, centred and neutral. Okay, so that's a very quick deconstruction of the term working with diversity. Okay, now there are 5 inherent problems with this term then of working with diversity. Straight away, and I kind of do call it out, it actually says that the term working with diversity then, or working with diversity and or difference, is oppressive. Because the moment we have working with diversity or difference and or difference, we make diversity and difference itself the bolt-on. So the first problem is that it becomes a bolt-on. Very often in thinking about diversity and difference, we think of it later on in our practice. We think about it perhaps secondary. And actually, it's reflected in our training because it's very often a bolt-on in our training as well. I know some courses have adapted and have modernised, and I'm hearing more and more courses in which it's embedded through. But traditionally, though, when we think about working with difference and diversity, because it lives with the client, it becomes a bolt-on in our training as well. And so by doing that, then we are always then considering the second problem here, that the client then is diverse and the counsellor is normative. So my second problem with the oppressive term of working with diversity is that it immediately sets up a dynamic, a relational dynamic, in which the client is diverse and the counsellor is normative. By then placing the counsellor as normative and neutral, my third problem with this term is that the counsellor's entire identity is missing. The counsellor's identity then, by being placed as normative or neutral, it really does hark back to the days of the counsellor being the blank slate. It really does position the counsellor as, in name only, the role of being counsellor, and the rest of their identity is missing from the relationship, from the process, and from the work we do therapeutically. So the third problem is the counsellor's identity is missing. What that then does, by hiding the counsellor's identity, the fourth problem with this term then is that it sets up a very particular relational dynamic and power dynamic in the therapeutic relationship between counsellor and client. There's a whole lot more to say about this, and that's kind of literally for another workshop on power and privilege and oppression. But what it sets up, though, is a very particular dynamic with our clients, because the moment we sit in a normative position, we hold the oppressive power over our clients, because what we're not doing is taking into consideration the impact and influence of our identity. And so that then leads us into the fifth problem, which is then an unequal weighting purely on the client's identity. There is such a focus then on, when we think about working with diversity or working with diversity and or difference, we end up only focusing on the client's identity. And this actually also shows up in the training, which might be working with, and literally the training, any particular session might include working with, and I almost visualize it as in brackets, insert here a particular identity, working with LGBTQ, working with gender, working with faith. So all of a sudden it creates a dynamic, not only in our relationships, but also in our training, in which we get placed in this position of thinking about the client's identity in isolation, that somehow working with diversity and or difference is about learning, cognitively learning the knowledge about a particular identity characteristic. It gets removed from relationships, and it gets removed from how we might interact and relate with diversity. Okay, so kind of a whistle-stop kind of deconstruction here of the context of why we need to shift into working within diversity. Okay, just want to pause there for a moment and just want to check in with everybody. Any just initial, just gives yourself a moment just to write down any initial kind of reflections or thoughts or questions you then might have. So just capture that in a moment, and then I'll open up the space just to check in with everybody. But just give yourselves a moment, just what that might then, your thoughts, reflections about it. I appreciate that it might bring up more questions than answers, perhaps, but, kind of capture them, what's coming up for you as we deconstruct, and in a moment, we're going to reconstruct in a whole new way. But what thoughts and reflections just do you have on this deconstructing of the term working with diversity? And if anybody would like to unmute and comment at all, give people the chance to do that, please do. MT, I see your hand up, please.
I guess what comes up, is the opportunity that it offers, because as soon as you stop thinking about diversity as being solely with the client, and you recognize that we all come from our own cultural contexts, then it also offers the opportunity to start thinking about how they might be interacting in the space, and that can be super interesting as well, for all sorts of reasons. So it just sort of feels like there's a real opportunity to thinking of it as being within rather than with.
So a real sense of kind of opening up the space. And yes, absolutely. And I hope actually then that when we reconstruct it, you will really get a feel for that as well. So there's something about the hopefulness, and as you're saying, MT, like the opportunities kind of open up for you as well in how we can then navigate these kind of spaces.
It brings another dimension in. And I love when you can do that. You can bring all of the hidden stuff in and look at it.
Absolutely. So we're opening up, making the space bigger, and it can allow more in. Absolutely. Lovely. Anybody else?
For me, it just feels very empowering, the way you've just described that, and it's such a it makes so much sense when you speak and how you explain it. And I think that just the term working with diversity, and actually it's not something that word with and then within, the difference it can make is huge. And working with actually then and looking at all these things feels very othering when we look at work within that way. And this feels far more inclusive and, yeah, I think very hopeful. And yeah, it's given me a lot to think about. It's yeah, hopeful, I think, is what I'm left feeling.
Yes, and I think you mentioned also a real key word there as well, Jade, that othering. And that's ultimately why it's an oppressive term, because actually that's exactly what it's doing. It's othering our clients, and it can, and so for me, that's why I have such a problem. As you can see, I have such a problem with the term, because not only is it othering, but also maybe unintentionally, and I don't know, unintentionally, unconsciously, unknowingly, this is then being taught as core training, this working with. So what we're actually teaching therapists, if we're not careful, is to other our clients. And that in and of itself is oppressive. So actually, are we working ethically if we are othering? You know, for me, this is a huge shift in ethical practice. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Jade. Yeah, really powerful. Anybody else? Sasha, please. Oh
no, it's okay.
Oh, please go ahead. Sorry, I can't see everyone. That's why.
Yeah, Sasha and then Jada. Yes.
It almost, I like that, because it's almost, it feels like when you're working with, it's almost like there's there's a non-existent. It's like you don't exist within that sort of kind of space, and that feels kind of dangerous. It's almost like, that sort of obviously they have to do that, but in the dentists, when they do an X-ray, it's like you're left in the room while they have to disappear outside the room. And I always feel kind of strange where they disappear while I'm exposed to, obviously for reasons, you're exposed to that sort of thing. And then that's the sort of image I've got, like working with. It feels a bit like that, really, sort of like at a distance.
Yes, absolutely at a distance, but also what I've really just in what you just said, Sasha, I really felt like this kind of gut punch of kind of almost like an abandonment. You know, it's almost like you're leaving your client to go, well, you're over there. And I'm over here observing you, almost like I'm in, like when they take an X-ray, they're behind like a little observation screen. And so absolutely, it's like an abandonment of the client. Like, client, you're in the process, and I'm, as the counsellor, I'm going to hide behind and protect myself, but I'm going to observe you through this screen. So yeah, a real kind of disconnection, abandonment, and between you and your client. Yeah, absolutely, that's so powerful. Yeah. Great, thank you. Jada.
Hi. Yeah, it does make sense. And I think what's coming up for me is about like we're positioned based on even as a therapist, what is visible in terms of our identity. And I was thinking a lot about what is also invisible, or even, for example, with ethnicity, or like even your name can reveal where you're from, or sometimes you can also, I guess I'm thinking about people of mixed heritage, for example. So I think it's really sort of drawing attention to like what is visible about identity and what's also invisible, and what assumptions can be made.
Yes.
Because I think clients also make assumptions about us.
Massively, yes.
Yeah, and I encounter that quite a lot in my work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, great. Yes, yeah, and again, we're going to be thinking about this throughout the day as well, kind of what is visible and what gets thought about. And key part of attunement is, attuning to what is seen and unseen. Yes, lovely. Thank you, Jada. Anybody else? Just give everyone a chance if they want to. Sarima.
I wanted to add that, I never thought of just that one word can make so much difference. Like working with diversity and working within it, it completely changes the perspective. Because definitely our identity as a therapist is impacting our clients. Like if I have my hair opens, it can probably, someone can get triggered by it. If I am wearing a particular scent, that might also impact someone. Sometimes that might also take away the idea of normalcy when we're othering our clients, that, you know, that our therapist or counselor is in much more superior state where they have everything figured out. I think it also takes away the human element out of it, where you're actually witnessing someone's pain. When you say that, you know, I'm working with diversity, you're also othering the pain, not only the identity, but the pain that you're witnessing. And sometimes it can be really powerful to just say that, you know, I can feel the pain that you're feeling right now. I'm a witness to your pain. So I think it's really enlightening in terms of normalcy, what people consider normal, what certain cultures have implied that, you know, this is something that we consider normal, and you're being deviant from that normalcy. So yeah, thank you for sharing this.
Thanks. Again, you're making a really important point about what's also missing then is the relationship, that by othering, actually focusing only on the client, linking it to what Sasha said, it becomes a pure focus just on the client in isolation, out of relationship. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else want to, or it's always an invitation for people to share, it's not compulsory, but a chance for anybody else to share if they want to. Yeah.
I think what it brought up for me was around concepts like projection and bracketing and like the boundaries between self and other and that kind of thing. I feel like I haven't quite figured it out because I work relationally as well, and there's something about what Jada was saying about what's visible and not, and how that sometimes worked to some sort of relational advantage, because if I work with somebody maybe who comes from a different community to mine, there's something about, like, without me having to say anything about my identity, it just speaks for me, and therefore that can come into the conversation. But then also there's another element which is like around projection or bracketing, and how do you, like, you know, work within that to make it about the client and allow them the space to like explore what's going on for them without with using your humanness, but without necessarily, I guess, overstepping those like psychological boundaries in a way where it's like, how can I enrich the young the client that I'm seeing without like emerging, like, do you know what I mean? Like, that it's about this kind of psychology around it, I guess.
Absolutely. And again, making a really important point there, Iman, around that it's about being in relationship and being relational with our clients, whilst at the same time holding the boundary that the process is to focus on the client. So for me, absolutely, and I think what we'll get from today as well is it's this delicate balance about, yes, both of us being in the room and being in relationship, but our role though is to hold the client and to think, and you know, we're holding their truth, we're holding and exploring and honoring their lived experience. So how do we be in relationship with them at the same time as doing our job as well? Absolutely. Great. Okay, everybody has shared that wants to. What we'll then do is, having kind of deconstructed working with, we're now going to kind of build from new, working within. So we're going to be reconstructing working within. So moving on to the next slide, we're starting from the same position though of counsellor and client. So again, two circles. One has counsellor written inside it, the other circle has client written inside it. This time though, when we say that we are in therapeutic relationship with our client, it is a two-way arrow. It is an arrow pointing both towards counsellor and client. So what this immediately says is that by having two people in the room and in the relationship, we therefore have two identities in the room and in relationship. So written underneath counsellor and client is the word identity. So in the previous model with working with, we had diversity lives here that was written under client. This time round, we simply have identity written beneath both counsellor and client. So this immediately sets us up as having straight away it's different from working with diversity. Working within diversity starts with the premise that there are two people in relationship together, and therefore two identities in the room. Because then that there are two identities in the room, and those identities are the intersectional identities containing all aspects of who we are, of who I am as the counsellor and who the client is, we are both then within diversity. So those two circles then are placed within a larger container, within a larger rectangle here, a bigger boundary of diversity. And so I often think about this of using the metaphor of a swimming pool. So if diversity is the swimming pool and the water in it, we are then two people in the swimming pool, okay? So rather than diversity being the blue English heritage plaque, which is with the client, we take that and make it into the actual context that we are both within. Hence why I say working within diversity, okay? Because diversity exists, the moment we think about two identities, it is not that one person is diverse and the other being neutral or normative or centered, but rather we are within diversity because in those two identities, they are diverse between them, okay? And therefore then in my identity, I have my own unique diversity of my identity. The client has their own unique intersectional diverse identity, and we are both working within that diversity, okay? So rather than, and I think it goes back to MT, your point about all of a sudden we're opening up the space. What we've gone from is a little English Blue Heritage plaque that, you know, the client holds, to all of a sudden both of us jumping into a ginormous, you know, think like an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and diversity becomes our context, not our identity. We have our identity that then exists literally within a pool of diversity. Hence why I think about the swimming pool metaphor. So that is the basis of working within diversity, like that in terms of the concept, the reconstructed concept of when we think about what is working within diversity, this is the reason why I say we are within diversity, not with. And based then upon this concept of working within diversity, and diversity then being the pool of identities, we can then move into then, well, how does this then apply, or what do we need to think about then when working with clients? And on my next slide then is the actual working within diversity model. It's a 5-component model. And so the structure of this model is the same, two circles within a larger rectangle of diversity. But that rectangle is then placed within an even larger rectangle, okay? So think of one rectangle placed over another one in the background, and then within that middle rectangle are the two circles, the counsellor and client. So what the model consists of then is 5 components. So we're going to build this model. So from the largest rectangle, think of that being the largest container. Okay, so we're starting with one large rectangular container. And that is our first component, which is structural and systemic contexts. Okay, so we have component number 1, structural and systemic context. And that includes thinking of the structural and systemic context of counselling itself. Okay, so that's the very first largest rectangle. If we then within that larger rectangle, sorry, let me say that again, let me make this easier. The largest rectangle is the out there. The largest rectangle is structural and systemic context of the world, okay? Within that largest rectangle, we then have a slightly smaller rectangle within it, and that is the swimming pool of diversity, okay? So that middle, that inside smaller rectangle then that exists within it is that swimming pool of diversity. And then within that swimming pool, we go back to then having our counsellor and client within it, Okay, so that's the physical drawing figure of this picture. So our 5 components then are, number 1, that's structural and systemic context, which is the largest rectangle, the out there context of counselling. Our second component then is identity, that being the identity of both counsellor and client. Okay, so 2 identities in the room. And then we have component number 3, that is, in us being in therapeutic relationship with our clients, our third component then to think about is power. Because inherently in our work and in our relationships and process, a huge part of that underlying embedded component of what happens is to do with power. The fourth component then is, of course, and between counsellor and client, we are in therapeutic relationships. So our fourth component is the therapeutic relationship itself. And our fifth component of what we are doing between ourselves and our clients is the work itself, which is the therapeutic process. So that's the fifth component. So these are the 5 components of anti-oppressive practice. Okay. And as I mentioned, we can only do this, or we can only think about this model if we move from that working with to working within diversity. These components in this model cannot be placed into the working with concept because it just would not take into account 2 identities, the context of diversity, it doesn't take into consideration the wider structural and systemic contexts. And neither does it by not being explicit that there are 2 identities in the room. It immediately negates and takes away us thinking about what is actually happening in our relationships and process because there are 2 identities present. So you can see why we have to make this shift from working with to working within, because only by shifting into working within can we actually acknowledge that these concepts are actually present in our work. Okay. Again, I'm just going to give everyone just a couple of minutes just to capture thoughts, reflections, any questions. So just give yourselves a few minutes just to jot anything down that you want to capture. Give everyone just another minute or so. I can see some heads down. So yeah, just capture at this stage any kind of immediate thoughts, reflections, comments, maybe feelings, how you feel about it, what it brings up for you. Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm just doing a quick time check for us all as well. We're going to take a break at 20 past. So we've got just over 15 minutes still before our break. So what I'm going to do in these kind of final 15 minutes up until break, I'm then going to talk you through the next slide, which are kind of the 7 principles that underlie this model so that we can then start to think about cultural attunement after the break. But in thinking about these 7 principles, I'm going to walk us through them. Then I'm going to pop you into kind of small into 2 breakout rooms just for you just to sit and think about with each other your thoughts and reflections. Okay, so that's what we're going to do in these 15 minutes before the break. So on our next slide, I've got listed, and I'm going to talk us through each one, are the 7 principles then that for me underlie and create the foundation for the working within diversity 5 component model. As I said, you know, this is, I mean, well, first of all, I was going to say, you know, this topic is huge. Clear, we're not going to cover it in a day. You know, specifically, we're looking at cultural attunement today. But what I'm just going to read out for you then are these 7 principles, just so that you understand where cultural attunement comes into this model, but also how it links to all these other principles as well. So the first principle being, this is about being anti-oppressive, not inclusive. Now, that might strike you as a bit, what's wrong with inclusive or inclusion? Now, what I want to say is that there's nothing wrong with inclusion. You know, there's a lot of work being done in the last few years with DEI, you know, diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion. However, for me, inclusion is only the first step. It, for me, is when we think about the term inclusion, if we are to quickly deconstruct it, what inclusion means is that the door is open for everybody. Okay, that in a very again, for those of you that know me in my teachings, I'm very metaphorical. I use a lot of metaphor. Whenever I think of the term inclusion, I always think about supermarkets. Inclusion for me would be a 24/7 Asda that's open, for example. And so inclusion means turn up, the door's open 24/7. That for me is what inclusion means. It means that the space is available to everybody. Okay. Whereas what anti-oppressive does is, the first step to anti-oppressive practice is inclusion, but it's the first step. It goes, yeah, we're open 24/7. Here is the doorway or gateway coming into the space. But what anti-oppressive actually does is it says, yes, I want to have people feel that they can come into a space. But what I'm also ensuring is that I'm going to also think about what is going to stop people from accessing that space. What might be the barriers? Also, I'm going to consider how people might experience entering and navigating and accessing that space. And thirdly, and most importantly, I'm going to acknowledge that I, as the owner of that space, have power in that space. And how do I ensure then that, A, I'm not using my power over people accessing that space? And secondly, that as people enter that space, when people come into a space that I'm in charge of, that I'm ensuring that they are then experiencing a relationship with myself and with everyone else that is equal. That what is not happening is an experience of othering. That what is not happening is an experience of exclusion or othering. That I am acknowledging that there is power in our relationships once in the space, and how do I then work to equalize or flatten that power? That is in a nutshell what additionally anti-oppressive practices is going to take on board or consider. Like I said, inclusion is just about allowing everyone in the space. That's it. I'm not thinking about what my identity is. I'm not thinking about anyone else's identity. All I'm saying essentially in inclusion is, oh, I'm a 24/7 Asda. Anyone can come in. What I'm not thinking about is accessibility. What I'm not thinking about is how people are going to be in relationship with me and with each other in that space. Okay. So for me, an ultimate element or principle of this model is that the work is anti-oppressive, not just inclusive. The second principle then is, of course, and when we're thinking about anti-oppressive practice then, is that we have to acknowledge and understand that we live in a world that its inherent structure is of systemic, structural, and social inequality and oppression. That the world does not treat everybody equally. That socially and culturally, not everybody is treated the same. That not everybody has the same access to opportunities. That not everybody is afforded the same benefits. Okay, it's an inherent part of anti-oppressive practice that we've got to recognise and acknowledge that we live in a world and we all navigate the world and its frameworks. We all exist within the frameworks of systemic, structural, and social inequality. The third principle of the model of working within diversity, we've mentioned this already, is that there are two identities. Okay, an inherent aspect of working within diversity is that in any given relationship, there are two identities. And of course, if we're talking about working with groups or more than two people, there are as many identities as people in that group. 3 people, like today, there are 8 of us in this group. There are 8 intersectional identities in our group space today. The fourth principle then is that for any relationship where there are 2 people, 2 identities, there are then 2 truths. There is the lived experience and truth of the counsellor, and there is the lived experience and truth of the client. And again, multiply that by number of people in any given group. For the number of people in any group, there are the same number of identities and the same number of truths. And what I mean by truth is that what I'm honouring and respecting and holding is that somebody else's lived experience is their truth. And whilst it might be, and it will be different to my own, what I then don't do is negate, dismiss, devalue their truth, their lived experience, that I can simultaneously hold somebody else's truth whilst also honouring and holding my own. That what they are not doing, they are not mutually exclusive. Okay. Based on the two truths and two identities concept then, the fifth principle then is that there are then two identities in the therapeutic relationship. But what we are not doing is saying, whilst there might be two identities out there in the world, that the moment I go into my therapeutic relationships, I don't step into this position of being the blank slate. That I don't somehow leave my identity at the door. That is impossible to do. Our whole identity is in therapeutic relationship with our clients and vice versa. Principle number 6 then is, of course, being culturally attuned, the essence of today's workshop. And this is, of course, what we're going to be deep diving into today. It is to be culturally attuned and to practice cultural attunement with our clients. I'm not going to say any more about it at this stage because, of course, this is what we're going to spend the rest of today thinking about. And then the 7th principle then is that by understanding all the previous 6 principles, what we are ultimately doing in principle 7 is we are re-establishing external contexts. And what I mean by that is that very often when we think about therapy and our training for therapy, is that we often think about therapy as being in a vacuum, separate from the rest of the world. But what takes place between me and my client is in a little vacuum, in a safe, confidential space, which the rest of the world doesn't touch. Yet actually, what we have got to acknowledge is that our counselling practice not only takes place within an external context, that broadest rectangle in the model, not only does our work exist within the world, the rest of the world, but also it's about re-establishing that external context for what the client brings into the work as well. Yeah, that there is a direct relationship between what the client is experiencing out there in this external out there world, and of course then what they're then bringing into the counselling room. Okay. So again, as I said, a very quick run through here of these principles that underline the model, because what we are going to be looking at today is, of course, deep diving into principle 6, cultural attunement, but also what you're going to hear today is how closely it relates to and is connected with the other principles as well. So that's why we can't just look at cultural attunement in isolation. It exists in relationship and within this broader context of working within diversity. Okay. What I'm going to do is just stop sharing so we can all come back into gallery view. Again, just give everyone a moment just to capture any thoughts or reflections they have on that. And then I'm going to pop you into breakout rooms just to share with one another your thoughts on what we've done so far. Okay, so just give yourselves a moment just to capture your thoughts. Just, your immediate thoughts and reflections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop you into a breakout room just for 5 minutes. But what I would like you to do then is to share with perhaps one another what your immediate thoughts might have been. But what I would specifically like to do, and what I'll do is I'll write this question in the chat so that you also have it visually in front of you, but I'll also read out the question in a moment. But what I'm going to invite you to do just for 5 minutes is to think about in your small groups, in what ways does that working within diversity model and its principles support or challenge how you currently work? Okay, so how does the model support or challenge how you currently work? And therefore, perhaps based on that, then, are you already starting to think about what you might need to change or do differently? Okay, So how does the model that now support or challenge how you work, and what might you then need to do differently? What I'll do is I'll pop that into the chat once I've got you into your breakout rooms. So I'll create 2 breakout rooms, and what I'll do is I'll assign manually, only because otherwise I end up in a room. So it'll be 1 group of 3 and 1 group of 4. Okay. Okay, I'm going to open all the rooms in a moment. If you're not familiar with breakout rooms on Zoom, a little pop-up will come on and you'll just need to press that button to go to it. If anybody needs any help getting into their room, please let me know. I'm just going to open the rooms. You'll have, I'll give you 5 minutes until 20 past, okay? So I'm going to open all the rooms now. Welcome back.
Hello.
We'll just wait for the other group as well. That's fine. How was that? Good chance to talk through things?
I think it just showed the weight of it all somehow.
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it? It's like, gosh, the shift is to really think differently, isn't it, about the work we do.
Myra, while people are waiting to join, can you just remind me what's the difference between inclusion and anti-oppressive practice, if that's not going to take too long?
Very, very simply, inclusion is you're purely focusing just on the door, if that makes sense. Like it's purely about people coming in through the door. It doesn't actually consider what actually happens in the space.
Okay.
Anti-oppressive practice focuses on, yes, how people access and get through the door, but its primary focus is then on what is actually then going on in the space.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Welcome back, everybody. Just want to check in that everyone is okay after that breakout, and right, lovely. I appreciate that. I think Imani mentioned it as he came back. It goes, gosh, it's a lot, and it's really good to share the weight of it. I see heads nodding in the group as well.
Yeah.
Can I just check in that everyone is okay? And is there anything that people need to come back and say or share? Again, I appreciate it might bring up things for people, but okay. What we'll do is then I think good time to take a break. We'll take a break. We'll come back in 20 minutes, or we'll be back at 22. Okay. And then actually, no, because we've gone to the break slightly late. So come back at 1:45. So yeah, good proper 20-minute break. Come back at 1:45. And then we'll kind of dive into then cultural attunement. Okay.